Ex-racist subreddit. What made you change your mind? Sesame Street. I'm not even joking. Was raised in a slightly racist household in a pretty racist state. Seeing kids of all colors playing together made me wonder why my mom wouldn't let me play with certain people. It kind of snowballed from there. I was a baby when Sesame Street premiered. We lived in a small rural town that was 97% white and recognized two religions, Catholic and Protestant. My favorite character was Gordon and my favorite activity was counting in Spanish. My conservative parents tried so hard, and they got a 7-year-old Jimmy Carter supporter who grew up to be a civil rights activist. None of us made the connection until recently, but Sesame Street literally broke the cycle of generational racism in families like mine. Short answer: rap music and a curious mind. But what's more impressive is how thick of a shell it cracked. My stepfather, who pretty much raised me, was as a Klansman, and so is his father, brothers, etc. This was an old-fashioned family too. My mother didn't speak unless spoken to. My sisters were expected to marry who my stepfather chose. This was normal to us. I was expecting to find a woman to marry and start a family as soon as I was 18. I'm 23 now, so this was recent. My stepfather beat my older sister black and blue for sleeping with a black man. He always told us that black people are rapists and gangbangers, and that Mexican while hard workers are all dirty people and will never amount to anything useful aside from cheap labor. He controlled what we watched and played to reinforce his beliefs in us. On top of this, he was a devout Christian. I was a closeted atheist since 16. But he would have literally killed me if he knew. He believed that gay people should be killed alongside of atheists and Muslims. He wasn't focused on Jews for whatever reason. I had never met a person of color until I was 17, so I never experienced anything firsthand to contradict what I was told. Sometime in my late teens I discovered rap and was obsessed. First song I heard was by Tupac and I was obsessed. Well, as I learned more, it led me to Martin Luther King Jr. and what he did for people of color. At some point I broke down crying because I realized everything I was told was a lie. When I realized I was an atheist, I decided I couldn't operate under my old mindset, so I needed something to replace it and decided to go with the speech that broke my hatred. I decided I would judge everyone based on their actions, not the color of their skin or who they prefer to sleep with. I went to a mostly black school in a very poor area and I was bullied for being white and nerdy. I hated black people with a passion. Then I graduated, went to college where black people were cool to me. I realized it wasn't black people I hated, it was that inner city culture of racism. Good case could be made that I was racist as a kid, when I was raised by and surrounded by racists for my entire childhood. Stopped pretty quick when I joined the army, since I got out of that small shithole southern town echo chamber. Experienced we were all equally shitty in Uncle Sam's eyes. Watched another recruit get FTA'd for calling another recruit the N-word. Witnessed a drill sergeant yank 2 recruits out and smoke the shit out of them for flashing gang signs. And just generally got the idea that racism and tribalism was incohesive and destructive. Didn't fully stop for a while longer, though. Took decades to quit hearing my dad or mom in my head when I saw a black guy go down the street, going, "Watch out for that N." Shit is pervasive about being the first thing that pop up on reflex in your head. Squash it the next, but it still was the first for a while. Shit is pervasive about being the first thing that pop up on reflex in your head. Squash it the next, but it still was the first for a while. It isn't the first thought in your head that defines you, it's the second. That's something my therapist taught me. Basically, you can't really control what your first thought on something is. It's an instinctive reaction based on prior experiences. Your second thought comes when your conscious brain has had time to process the situation. In this case, that second thought shows that you are working to overcome the racism you have been taught throughout your life, which says more about your character than that instinctive first thought. I grew up and moved out of my parents' house. Did you stay in contact with your parents after that? I have a really hard time accepting that my dad is racist and says really stupid and disgusting things, especially cause he is an immigrant himself. Yes, of course. Saw them until the day he died. I just didn't teach my kids their way of thinking. I'm Asian, and I grew up kind of resenting my parents for being different than my classmates' parents, and I hated that they didn't know how to speak English. I had to translate for them all the time, call phone companies, go to the DMV with them, translate documents, etc. And I grew resentful. So when I was in elementary school, I told them that I wasn't Korean, but that I'm a full-fledged American, and I wasn't going to speak Korean anymore. I also hated interacting with other Asians that reminded me of my parents, aka textbook internalized racism. It wasn't until middle school when I had a teacher that validated my culture and actively tried to communicate with my parents that I realized that bilingualism is an asset and something I should be proud of. Now I'm going into teaching and have done some translating work on the side. People say my Korean is super fluent for an American-born Korean, and I really have my parents to thank for that. Now I'm super regretful for hurting them like that. Just want to say you're not alone in this. Many Asian Americans face the same problem and have a lot of self-hatred, especially when growing up with the white folks. It's great that you're finally able to embrace your identity. Good on you. TLDR, being forced to be racist by family stopped me from actually being racist. Also my mom. I had a super racist grandpa and uncle. Both pieces of shit supported by my grandma. I would frequently stay with them while both my parents worked on Saturdays. I would pretend around them when I was younger because I wanted them to like me. I don't remember this story, but my mom will tell it so proudly if the subject of racism comes up. She was very different from her dad brother. I was maybe 6 or 7 when one day I was crying when my mom picked me up, and the whole way home I just sobbed like my heart was broken. I wouldn't tell her what was wrong, but I cried quietly the whole way home and went right into my bed and laid down crying. My dad and her came in and asked me what was wrong. I still didn't want to tell them, and my dad got a little gruff with me. Boy, you tell me what's wrong right now. If somebody hurt you or told you not to tell me. And I guess I started crying loudly for the first time and blurted out, Grandpa and Uncle Chuck said I can't be friends with Malcolm anymore because he is a dirty nardwurm. My uncle made me call him and say that to him. My mom immediately flew into a rage. She went down there and, from what I told, beat the living shit out of her brother, told her dad that I would not be coming over anymore and that he was no longer invited to any family events. She then drove to my friend's house with blood from my uncle's nose still on her shirt, apologized profusely for what happened and told them the story and that I had been crying the whole time because my uncle made me do that. We had dinner the next day, and instead of going to my grandpa's house on Saturdays, I ended up going to my friend Malcolm's house. Note, I say had because my grandpa is dead, and later in life I told my uncle, who never changed, that he's not my uncle anymore when he called my 2-year-old half Mexican niece a sick. He now has a half Mexican grandson, but from what I hear he hasn't really changed. I went away to college. I was a kid in a racist family. N-bombs were thrown around the dinner table regularly. I had really only met a few African Americans in my whole life. I was also the first in my family to go to college, other than my brother to seminary for the cult my family is in, which I don't count. My friend Richard Redacted was my first black friend. I think he only liked me at first because he had a crush on my friend Amy and she would always be at my parties. But we ended up friends for 4 years. I'm naturally sort of empathetic and am good at putting myself in others' shoes. It just sort of dawned on me very early on that I wouldn't speak or act that way if he was around, so I just decided I should never act that way. It took me a little while to forgive myself for being garbage, but I was a kid and literally didn't know any better. Oh yeah, and I fired my shitty family. I haven't talked to Rich in over 20 years. I moved 3,000 miles away after college, and as you might expect from his name, it is basically impossible to Google him. If you are out there, Rich, thanks. A guy I worked with said he was neo-Nazi as a teenager and ended up in prison somehow. He hated Jews for some reason, and blacks. He was never clear on why, just that he had so much hatred in his heart, and that was his outlet. He was in prison for many years. I think he almost killed somebody by beating them up. So, many years later and in prison, there was a mentor type staff there, and this one lady was so helpful to him, and she cared about him so much that it really started to get into his head the idea of being a positive person. Then, he learned that she was Jewish, and he said he couldn't believe she was so kind and caring despite the fact he was a claimed neo-Nazi. From that day he swore to be a better person. He learned his lesson. He's a pretty great guy these days, doing his family thing and making sure his son grows up with lots of love and all that he didn't have. Really remarkable. Great guy. My grandma grew up in Virginia in the 1900s. Being racist is just the default setting. Nana loved her family more than anything, though. So at one point in the late 1980s, she met her first not 100% white grandkid, and discovered she still loved him. She made astounding late life progress accepting that darker skin toned people were not only people, but family, friends and welcome in her house. Reminds me of what a comedian said, "Yay, I grew up in a very racist part of Virginia called Virginia." Thank you for watching. Check out my Patreon to get early access to future videos. Every patron gets a special thank you message in my videos. If the video slapped, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more videos every single day. See you tomorrow.